February 8, 1944. The sky over Munster was clear, pale blue and bitterly cold. Contrails crisscrossed at 30,000 feet, white threads pulled tight across Germany. Below them, a formation of P-47 Thunderbolts escorted a stream of bombers home from their run. The engines droned in steady rhythm, the air calm for the first time in hours. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas J. Lynch sat in the lead flight, hand on the throttle, eyes on the clouds below. He was 30 years old, already a legend. 20 confirmed kills, a survivor of more than 70 missions. His squadron trusted him completely. When Lynch was on the radio, men listened. When he broke formation, they followed. That morning, the group had turned west for home when he spotted movement on the ground. A line of trucks winding through the snow toward a small German town. Smoke rose from their engines. To Lynch, it was an invitation. The war was ending, he thought. One more dive, one more strike. He rolled his aircraft inverted and pushed the stick forward. The P-47 dropped like a falling hammer, air screaming over the canopy. His wingmen shouted, "Tommy, stay high, we've done our job." The radio crackled again. "Lead, hold formation." But he was already committed. The altimeter spun downward. 15,000, 10, 8. Lynch leveled out a few hundred feet above the ground and opened fire. Tracers raked through the convoy. One truck erupted in flame, another swerved off the road. Then the sky turned black. Hidden flak guns opened up, bursts of fire climbing toward him in symmetrical patterns. Shrapnel tore through his left wing. The cockpit filled with smoke. His wingman saw the Thunderbolt roll once, then climb steeply, as if clawing for altitude. The nose pitched up, then the aircraft vanished in a blossom of orange and gray. Silence on the radio. The formation regrouped, circling once, twice, scanning the smoke column. No parachute, no signal, only the echo of static in the empty slot where Lynch's plane should have been. When they reached base, the men taxied in formation. -1. His cot remained untouched, flight gear neatly folded beside it. Someone hung his helmet on the bedpost and left it there. He had been called fearless, unstoppable, invincible. But the truth was simpler. He had been human, brave enough to break the pattern and unlucky enough to prove why patterns exist. In every air base from England to Italy, young pilots whispered the same legend, that the best flyers were the ones who broke away, who trusted instinct more than orders. The stories were old before the war even began. In training films, aces were portrayed as lone hunters who dove through clouds, turned impossible odds, and came home with smoke trailing from their wings. Posters showed smiling men in leather jackets with the word "fearless" printed underneath. Thomas J. Lynch grew up on those myths. To him, the sky was not a formation, but a frontier. He had joined the Army Air Corps before Pearl Harbor, when the job still felt romantic. His first kills came not from tactics, but from reflex. He once told a fellow pilot, "If you see the enemy, you go in. That's the whole secret." It wasn't a strategy. It was faith. But by 1944, faith was no longer enough. The air war over Europe had changed from duels to systems. What once looked like courage now looked like interference. The Americans flew in massive formations, waves of bombers escorted by wings of fighters, each formation guided by radar and ground controllers across the channel. The enemy no longer appeared out of nowhere. They appeared on a grid. Still, the myth of the lone hero survived. Pilots compared themselves to knights of the sky, chasing glory one dive at a time. Lynch embodied that old creed. He hated escort duty, called it flying in circles. He wanted movement, contact, the clean certainty of a kill. His commanders, though proud of his record, worried about his impatience. "Lynch flies like he's immortal," one report said. The truth was that courage and control had begun to diverge. The new war required teams, not individuals, formations, not improvisation. But the old instinct, one man diving alone against a line of guns, refused to die. When the bombers turned home on February 8th, the radios were quiet, the skies momentarily safe. Lynch saw the column below and reverted to the code he had always lived by. Act fast, strike first, fear nothing. He wasn't reckless, he was consistent. The war around him had evolved, but his idea of heroism had not. That gap, the space between instinct and system, was measured in seconds, and it was there that courage turned fatal. He believed heroism won dogfights. By the time his wingmen saw the smoke rising from the fields, the myth had already burned away. By 1944, the air war over Europe was no longer fought by men. It was fought by systems. Every sortie, every interception, every victory began on the plotting boards of Britain and ended in the wreckage of German fields. The 8th Air Force had become a machine the size of a nation. Its heart beat in operations rooms filled with chalkboards, radios, and teletype machines. When a raid took off, thousands of people on the ground already knew its route, altitude, and timing down to the minute. At its peak, the 8th could put more than 1,000 bombers and 600 fighters into the air in one day. Each bomber formation was protected by fighters flying escort corridors, pre-planned in blocks of time and distance. Air combat was no longer chaos. It was choreography. The Germans answered with machinery of their own. Across occupied Europe stretched the Kammhuber Line, a radar belt that covered everything from the North Sea to the Swiss border. Each sector tracked incoming aircraft, guided interceptors, and coordinated flak batteries. A single P-47 or B-17 showing up on radar could trigger dozens of gun positions within seconds. What once had been a duel between pilots now resembled a contest between networks. The battlefield had become invisible, defined by radio frequencies, radar sweeps, and oxygen altitudes. A man could be shot down by someone he never saw. Yet many pilots still clung to the romance of an earlier war. The dogfights of 1918. The image of the lone ace spinning through clouds in pursuit of glory. Lynch belonged to that breed. His P-47 Thunderbolt was powerful but slow to climb. It thrived at high altitude and formation, not alone at treetop level. But Lynch hated the routine of escort missions. He wanted movement, not patience. To him, the sky was still personal. His commanders were men of a different mindset. They thought in grids, ranges, and fuel consumption rates. They spoke of mutual coverage and altitude blocks, not courage. Their world was statistical. Lynch's was instinctive. In 1944, both worlds collided. The U.S. Army Air Forces had built an empire of precision. The radar network in England, the ground controllers in France, the coordination between weather reports and refueling schedules. Every man was a gear in something larger than himself. Inside that empire, there was no room for individual improvisation. A pilot who broke from formation did not just risk his own life. He risked the timing of hundreds of others. But men like Lynch, forged before the system existed, could not fully submit to its rhythm. The machinery of air superiority demanded obedience. He offered passion. It was a fatal mismatch, one that turned legends into liabilities. Numbers never flinch, and in the air war over Europe, they told a truth no legend could hide. By early 1944, the average life expectancy of a new fighter pilot was 17 missions. That figure, just 17, hung over every airfield in England like a cloud. For bomber crews, the number was even worse, 11. The sky that looked infinite from the ground had become a narrow corridor of mathematics where luck was measured in altitude and seconds. Lone wolves died fastest. Records from the 8th Air Force showed that pilots who broke formation were 3 times more likely to be shot down. The difference wasn't courage, it was geometry. Formations overlapped fields of vision, creating a web of protection. One plane covered another's blind spots. One wingman guarded the tail of the next. Together, they made a structure the Germans could barely penetrate. Alone, a pilot was just a dot on a radar screen, an easy equation for a flak gunner to solve. Below 10,000 feet, the odds worsened sharply. German territory was laced with anti-aircraft guns. on rooftops, in railway yards, hidden among trees. There was one flak position for every 250 yards along major routes. A single burst could throw 500 steel fragments through the air, and each fragment could tear a wing apart. For every minute spent below that altitude, a pilot's chance of death rose by more than 20%. Altitude was safety. Procedure was life. But procedure felt lifeless to men raised on stories of glory. American doctrine had evolved to protect them. Tight, finger-four formations that allowed fluid movement without isolation. Studies showed that those formations increased mutual survival by 38%. Every move had its place, angles, throttle settings, intervals. The system worked, but it demanded submission. It required men to trust in math over instinct. Lynch understood those numbers, but he never believed they applied to him. He was an ace, a survivor, a man whose reflexes had saved him dozens of times. His logbook was a list of personal victories. 1 Messerschmitt, 2 Focke-Wulfs, 3 trains destroyed. His instincts had always worked before. The problem was that instinct had an expiration date. By 1944, the Germans had learned too. Their flak crews practiced on lone attackers. Their radar screens tracked individual aircraft in under 30 seconds. Every time a pilot dove alone, the grid woke up. Dozens of guns turned and mathematics did the rest. The truth was merciless. Heroism had become a statistical liability. The longer you stayed in formation, the higher your odds of returning home. The moment you broke away, the numbers stopped working for you and started working against you. The morning of February 8, 1944, began quietly. The mission was routine. Escort bombers striking rail targets near Münster, then returned to England. The 353rd Fighter Group climbed through thin clouds, their P-47 Thunderbolts glinting silver in the sun. Engines droned in unison, the sound of organized power. Inside the cockpits, men checked fuel levels, watched gauges, and waited for contact. Nothing moved below but smoke from the frozen villages. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Lynch led the group. His reputation filled the radio silence. He had 20 confirmed victories, a string of decorations, and the swagger that came with surviving every kind of danger. To his squadron, he was a mix of mentor and myth. When he spoke, younger pilots listened. When he dove, they trusted his judgment. The mission unfolded as planned. The bombers dropped their loads and turned home. No enemy fighters appeared. For once, the sky was theirs. Then, through a break in the clouds, Lynch spotted something moving on a road, a convoy of trucks heading west. They were German, maybe carrying ammunition. A small, tempting target. He called out, "I see movement down there, going in." His wingman answered sharply, "Negative, Tommy. Stay high. We're over flak country." There was a pause. Then Lynch's calm voice. "Just one pass." He rolled the P-47 into a dive. The nose pointed down, the horizon spinning past the canopy. Airspeed climbed past 400 miles an hour. His aircraft shuddered. Below, the convoy stretched like a line of ants. He opened fire. Tracers streaked downward. 2 trucks exploded, black smoke curling into the air. From the trees came the answer. Flak guns, dozens of them. The sky lit up with bursting shells. His wingman shouted into the radio, "Pull up! Pull up!" Lynch's Thunderbolt wove through the explosions, pieces of shrapnel punching through its wings. The left aileron snapped. Smoke poured from the cowling. He tried to climb, the heavy plane trembling as it fought gravity. At 2,000 feet, the aircraft stalled. Witnesses saw it roll once, twice, and then detonate mid-air. A ball of flame rose above the convoy, no parachute, no signal. The formation circled helplessly. They could see the smoke column rising through the haze. The lead radioed, "We've lost Tommy." The words felt unreal. The man who had seemed untouchable was gone in seconds. Back at Metfield Air Base, the squadron returned 1 aircraft short. The men landed in silence. Ground crews counted the planes, then stopped. Lynch's gear remained in his locker. gloves, goggles, a photograph of his wife folded inside his flight jacket. On his cot lay his helmet, perfectly polished, waiting for another mission that would never come. For days, the men replayed his final moments. How he'd broken formation, how sure he'd sounded. It didn't seem reckless at the time. It had felt heroic. But the war had changed, and it no longer had room for lone heroes. In the logbook, the entry was simple. February 8, 1944. Missing in action, presumed killed. Nothing about courage or instinct or legend. Just coordinates and loss. He died doing exactly what he believed in. The tragedy was that belief itself had become obsolete. In the weeks after Lynch's disappearance, his squadron flew in tighter formation than ever before. No one spoke of heroism. They spoke of survival. His death had been quick, clean, and statistically predictable. The 8th Air Force Command reviewed the mission reports and issued a simple order. No more unauthorized dives, no more solo attacks below 10,000 feet. The phrase in the report was cold but final. Independent action increases loss probability beyond acceptable threshold. What had once been called bravery was now quantified as error. Lynch's dive became a data point in a new kind of arithmetic. Across the European theater, analysts compiled every pilot loss into charts and graphs. The pattern was clear. Nearly 70% of aircraft destroyed on escort duty had broken formation first. For every lone gun run, 3 pilots died for every one that scored a hit. The lesson was undeniable. Courage, uncontrolled, was just noise in the system. The U.S. Army Air Forces changed its training manuals within weeks. The new doctrine emphasized formation discipline, communication, and collective timing. Pilots learned that the sky belonged not to the bold, but to the synchronized. Mutual coverage replaced instinct. Altitude replaced aggression. The shift was psychological as much as tactical. Men who had been raised to idolize the ace now learned to fear him. The word individualist became a quiet insult, whispered with the same tone once reserved for coward. A hero who acted alone endangered everyone else. The math made it impossible to argue. Coordinated flights showed a 40% increase in mission survival. Every pilot who came home proved the point. By the time spring came, Lynch's name was still painted on the side of his old aircraft, Miss Pat Sick. But the man behind it had become a lesson in restraint. His legend was rewritten into a warning: the fearless die first. In war fought by machines and grids, courage without calculation was not strength. It was static. The sound of a man breaking from formation became background noise in a frequency the system no longer needed. The 56th Fighter Group, nicknamed Zemke's Wolf Pack, flew the same skies as Lynch, but their story unfolded in the opposite direction. Where he followed instinct, they followed structure. Where he saw targets, they saw timing. Under the command of Colonel Hubert Zemke, the Wolfpack became the deadliest Allied fighter group in the European theater, not because they were braver, but because they were colder. Zemke was no poet of the air. He was an engineer, a strategist, a man who believed numbers were worth more than nerves. He drilled his pilots endlessly. Every maneuver was standardized, every roll rehearsed until the men moved like gears in a watch. They trained not for glory, but for efficiency. Formation is life, Zemke told them. If you break it, you die alone. The Wolfpack flew the same P-47 Thunderbolts that Lynch had loved, but their philosophy turned those heavy planes into a coordinated weapon. Instead of chasing targets, they built ambushes. Instead of lone dives, they struck as one. When a German fighter appeared, the section didn't scatter. They folded around it like a trap. On March 8, 1944, the group faced its biggest test. 60 Focke-Wulfs intercepted their escort line over northern Germany. The Wolfpack leader called, "Stay tight, keep your quadrants." The Americans didn't pursue. They waited until the enemy crossed into overlapping fire arcs, then turned together. The sky filled with spirals of metal and smoke. In 10 minutes, the Germans lost 17 planes. Not a single American was shot down. The kill ratio that day, 17-0, was no miracle. It was the math of discipline. Every pilot in the Wolfpack could trust that his wingman would be exactly where he was supposed to be. Their radios spoke in short codes. 1 high, 2 low, 4 clear. Each phrase was an instruction, not a conversation. By mid-1944, Zemke's Wolfpack held the highest victory ratio in the 8th Air Force, over 8-1. Other squadrons wrote about courage. Zemke wrote manuals. He replaced the myth of the lone ace with the image of an air machine where every man was a component. Younger pilots admired the calm. Veterans called it inhuman. But it worked. When news of Lynch's loss reached them, the Wolfpack pilots read it with quiet respect. Some had known him. Many had idolized him. None wanted to die like him. Zemke's reports after that mission used no emotional language. One line captured the transformation of modern air combat. Courage is constant. Coordination is exponential. The Wolfpack proved that heroism could be industrialized. Their success didn't come from instinct, but from the suppression of it. Each flight was a moving equation: distance, altitude, ammunition, timing. And in that equation, the variable of personal glory no longer fit. The Americans still saluted courage. They just stopped trusting it to keep them alive. Across the front lines, the same myth was dying in a different language. The German Luftwaffe had once worshipped its own breed of lone hero. The Jagdflieger, the fighter knight, the man who hunted alone. Men like Günter Rall, Adolf Galland, and Erich Hartmann were celebrated as warriors of instinct, not procedure. Their portraits hung in mess halls. Their kill counts were printed in newspapers. For years, that image sustained the morale of a nation. But by 1944, the reality beneath the legend had already begun to rot. Germany's skies were shrinking. Radar screens lit up with Allied raids every morning, and fuel shortages turned airfields into graveyards of grounded aircraft. The same men who once soared freely were now caged inside a defensive grid. The Kammhuber line, Germany's vast radar network, had become both shield and shackle. Every interception was dictated by radio, every maneuver controlled from the ground. The age of the hunter was over. Oberst Günter Rall, one of Germany's top surviving aces, later recalled the shift. "The war killed the hunter's heart," he said. "We were still brave, but bravery meant nothing without fuel, without wings." His words echoed the same transformation that had claimed Lynch's life on the other side of the sky. Courage had become irrelevant in a war designed by machines. Even the Luftwaffe's best learned that instinct no longer mattered. Pilots who broke from radar control to pursue individual kills were often ambushed by Allied escorts or trapped in flak zones. German command reports from 1944 show that 70% of pilots lost during defensive interceptions had ignored ground instructions. Their names vanished into the same silence that claimed their American counterparts. Both sides had built myths of men who refused to yield. The fearless ace who defied orders and dove into danger. Both sides buried them the same way, under the mathematics of attrition. By 1944, Allied bombers flew in endless chains across Europe. German radar tracked them. Allied radar watched back. Fighters launched, fought, and died according to grid coordinates. It no longer mattered who was braver. The one who obeyed the system lived longer. One German report described the transformation bluntly. "The sky is now a machine. The pilot is a moving part." After the war, Hartmann and Galland, both survivors, spoke about the loss of individuality. "The young men believed they were knights," Hartmann said, "but knights do not survive against factories." In that symmetry lay the quiet truth of the air war. On both sides, courage had outlived its utility. The Americans called it procedure. The Germans called it control. But the result was the same. The lone pilot, once the symbol of flight itself, had become an anachronism. The sky no longer belonged to the fearless. It belonged to the synchronized. By 1944, the romantic war of the sky had ended. The lone hero was gone, replaced by formations, frequencies, and fuel tables. The same skies that once rewarded instinct now punished it. The age of individual valor had collided with the precision of machines, and the machines had won. Thomas J. Lynch was not a fool nor a reckless man. He was a relic, a warrior from an earlier war fighting inside a new one that no longer had room for him. His courage had not failed, it had been outmoded. The sky he entered that morning was not a place of adventure, but an enormous equation already solved before he took off. He flew into a future that had already declared him unnecessary. The myth of the ace died with men like him. Technology had replaced eyesight. Radar replaced instinct. The fighter pilot no longer hunted. He executed coordinates. His weapon was no longer bravery, but discipline. The sound of engines in formation replaced the cry of individual combat. Lynch's empty slot in the returning formation became the symbol of that transformation. It wasn't just the absence of a man, it was the absence of a philosophy. The fearless pilot, the lone hunter, the sky duelist, all had vanished into smoke and circuitry. The war had evolved beyond their reach. In debriefings, commanders spoke of Lynch-type losses, the way engineers discuss machine failure. His name became shorthand for what could no longer exist. He had not died for nothing. His death marked the exact point where human courage met the logic of industrial war, and lost. It was not a tragedy of weakness, but of timing. The system had simply moved faster than the soul. Every war buries its old heroes under its new math. Lynch was one of them. The last of the knights of the air, gone in the instant when instinct met radar and courage became static. He didn't die because he was afraid. He died because he wasn't. After the war, the world remembered the machines but forgot the men. Radar towers rose where runways once stood. Jet engines replaced propellers. Combat reports spoke in terms of altitude, bearing, and interception time, not courage. The new sky belonged to data, not instinct. Thomas J. Lynch's name was carved into a memorial in Pennsylvania, one among thousands of pilots who vanished inside the arithmetic of victory. His legend faded quietly, absorbed by the system he never learned to obey. The story of his dive became a footnote in history, a lesson written in wreckage, that fearlessness without discipline is just another form of blindness. Every age of war ends the same way, with a man who refuses to adapt and dies proving the rule. Lynch was that man. He flew like the sky still belonged to individuals. It didn't. Normandy, August 1944. The front had gone quiet for the night, but behind the lines the war was still alive. In the clatter of tools, the hiss of welding torches, and the smell of gasoline mixed with apple brandy. In a makeshift workshop near St. Lo, a squad of U.S. Army Ordnance mechanics worked under flickering lamps. The floor was mud, the walls were canvas, and every tank in the yard was half broken, half fixed. A Sherman sat in the center, engine open, panels stripped, wires dangling like veins. Its crew waited impatiently nearby, smoking, muttering. The tank had been sluggish all week, barely keeping up on the advance. Corporal Joe Tex Hargrove wiped oil from his hands, squinted at the Governor Assembly, and said what everyone was thinking. Hell, maybe it's not broke. Maybe it's just too damn sober. Someone laughed. Someone else passed him a dented bottle of Calvados they'd liberated from a nearby village. They drank just a sip each, more ritual than indulgence. The war had been long, the nights longer. Then came the idea. What if, Tex said slowly, we just take the limiter out? Let her breathe. The others stared. The Governor wasn't supposed to be touched. It controlled the engine's maximum RPM, kept the M4's radial power plant from tearing itself apart. But curiosity and alcohol have the same fuel. Within minutes, they had the housing open. Bolts clattered into the mud. They adjusted the throttle linkage, rerouted the fuel line, and filed down a part they didn't entirely understand. One man held the flashlight. Another hummed Glenn Miller through his teeth. The tank looked like a patient under crude surgery. By dawn, they were exhausted, grinning, and not entirely sure what they'd done. When the engine roared to life, it sounded wrong. Too sharp, too eager. The idle trembled. The crew climbed in for a test drive. They rolled the tank out of the tent, pressed the throttle, and the Sherman leapt forward like it had been reborn. 35 miles an hour down a dirt road, mud spraying, men shouting, laughter echoing over the hedgerows. From a nearby command post, an officer looked up in disbelief. What in God's name did they do to that thing? No one had an answer yet, but by sunset, everyone at the workshop had heard the same phrase whispered with a grin. The Calvados Special just outran a Jeep. For decades, the story of Allied armor has been told as one of uniformity. Identical Shermans rolling from Detroit's factories, stamped, numbered, and painted in olive drab. The myth says the Americans won through mass production, not imagination. Every bolt, every part, identical. Every crew, replaceable. Every tank, the same. But the men who kept those tanks running knew better. Out on the front, nothing was standard. Once a Sherman left the factory floor, it entered a different world. A world of mud, shrapnel, heat, and human improvisation. Manuals meant little. Tools broke. Spare parts ran out. And so men started inventing. The public saw industrial perfection. The soldiers saw constant failure patched by instinct. To them, the tank wasn't a machine. It was a living thing that limped, coughed, and aged like they did. Mechanics didn't repair them. They kept them alive by whatever means worked. Welding, scavenging, even stealing from wrecks. The official record never mentions whiskey or luck, but both flowed through every field workshop. The U.S. Army Ordnance units were less like factories and more like jazz bands. Every man played by ear. When something broke, they didn't always fix it the right way. They fixed it the possible way. That was how the line between mistake and innovation blurred. The myth of uniformity was comforting. It implied control. But real war was chaos organized by hands and hunches. Every tank that rolled through Normandy had a story behind it. Missing bolts replaced by nails, fuel lines patched with medical tubing, armor welded from spare track links. And sometimes those field repairs didn't just work. They improved performance. The Calvados Special was the ultimate proof. Commanders thought it was a malfunction until they saw it accelerate past everything else on the road. The tankers swore it felt different, more responsive, more alive. In a war obsessed with mass production, a handful of grease-stained mechanics had built something no engineer designed, a faster Sherman, born out of fatigue, frustration, and brandy. The myth said Allied tanks were all the same. The truth was that by the time they reached the front, no two were alike, and sometimes the chaos of difference was exactly what made them unstoppable. Behind every Sherman that rumbled through France stood an invisible army of mechanics, welders, and machinists who fought their own kind of war. One fought with grease, mud, and sleep deprivation, instead of rifles. They were the men of the U.S. Army Ordnance. Their battlefield was the workshop. When the 3rd Armored Division landed in Normandy, it brought along an entire mobile maintenance ecosystem. Armored recovery vehicles, machine lathes bolted to trucks, spare engines stacked in the open, and tents that served as field foundries. Each maintenance battalion followed the tanks like a shadow army, setting up repair depots just miles behind the front. A single ordnance company could service 40 tanks a week. The 45th Ordnance Maintenance Battalion, attached to the 3rd Armored, had 200 men and enough equipment to rebuild a tank from its own wreckage. They called it Detroit in a ditch. Conditions were brutal. The ground near St. Lo was a swamp of churned earth and diesel. Rain never stopped. Shells landed close enough to shake the work tables. Mechanics slept in shifts, sometimes on engine decks, waking only when the next crippled tank rolled in on a wrecker. The line between routine and improvisation vanished almost immediately. There were never enough correct parts. Tanks that came in with broken suspension arms might leave with parts from another model entirely. Crews swapped transmissions between wrecks, cut up armor plating from destroyed vehicles, and rewired electrical systems using salvaged aircraft cable. Each mechanic carried a dog-eared copy of the technical manual and ignored it. "We didn't fix them by the book," one veteran later said. "We fixed them by feel." They learned tricks factory engineers never imagined. Heating frozen pistons with blowtorches, hammering cracked gear teeth back into place, replacing fuel lines with medical tubing or Coca-Cola hoses. Their motto wasn't precision, it was persistence. And in that chaos, accidents were inevitable. Sometimes they broke more than they repaired, but once in a while, an error turned into a breakthrough. The Calvados Special came from that world. The workshop at St. Lo had seen too many dead engines, too many burned-out governors. The men were tired, cold, and drunk on fatigue. They wanted the tank to move faster, not because of strategy, but because they were sick of watching it stall in mud. They didn't know it, but when they pulled out that governor, they weren't just fixing a tank. They were rewriting the boundary between field work and engineering. War had turned them into something new. Accidental innovators. Every tank that fought in Normandy carried a secret battle inside its hull, a war between steel and friction. For all the talk of armor and firepower, the real killer of tanks wasn't always enemy fire. It was time, distance, and wear. The Sherman tank was built to be reliable, but Normandy destroyed machines faster than any battlefield before it. Dust-clogged filters, rain-soaked wiring, mud-jammed suspension bogies. Every hill burned fuel, every mile stretched metal. On paper, the M4's service life was 1,500 operational miles. In France, most didn't survive 200. The math of maintenance was brutal. A Sherman required an average of 26 hours of work for every 24 hours it spent moving. Field records from the 3rd Armored Division showed that 40% of all mechanical breakdowns came from the same two culprits, the carburetor governor and the fuel feed regulator. Those tiny components controlled the engine's heart rate, keeping the RPM low enough to preserve reliability. In theory, that saved engines. In reality, it strangled them. Crews complained constantly the tanks couldn't climb hills fast enough, couldn't keep up with advancing infantry, couldn't turn out of ambushes quickly. The engineers back in Detroit saw stability. The men in France saw slow death. And then came the numbers that commanders couldn't ignore. In July 1944 alone, more than 2,000 Shermans in the European theater were sidelined by mechanical failure, not combat damage. Of those, 80% were later repaired and returned to action by ordnance field teams. The system depended entirely on improvisation. Each ordnance unit tracked its own efficiency. The men joked about it like gamblers comparing odds. The best workshops boasted 30% faster turnaround than factory estimates, not through discipline, but through shortcuts. They worked with whatever they could find: French motor oil, melted down German tank treads, aircraft spark plugs. They cannibalized wrecks, welded scrap into armor, and wired fuel pumps from salvaged trucks. The result wasn't standardization. It was controlled chaos. Every tank became a prototype of itself. Every repair left fingerprints of ingenuity and exhaustion. So when one crew near St. Lo complained that their tank was as sluggish as a plow, the mechanics didn't reach for the manual. They reached for the wrench. They knew the governor was choking the engine. They'd seen it 100 times. But that night, fueled by fatigue and French brandy, they went one step further. They removed it. It wasn't doctrine, it was frustration turned into physics. And in that moment, war's greatest statistic, the endless grind of breakdown and repair, bent, just slightly, toward invention. It began after midnight, when the rain had stopped, but the mud still steamed. The mechanic's tent near St. Lo buzzed with the faint hum of generators and the pop of welding torches in the distance. The war never slept, and neither did the men who kept its machines alive. Corporal Joe Tex Hargrove stared at the Sherman sitting dead in front of him. Its crew had complained for days that the tank refused to climb hills, that its throttle response lagged, that it died like a tired horse. He'd already cleaned the carburetor twice, swapped the filters, and adjusted the throttle linkage. Nothing worked. He lit a cigarette, exhaled through his nose, and muttered, "Maybe she's just lazy." His partner, Private Collins, was elbow-deep in an engine casing. "Or maybe she's just got the governor hangover. Same as the rest of us." They both laughed. And that was when Tex said it. Half a joke, half a dare. "Then hell, let's take the limiter out and see if she can still dance." Collins stared. "You serious?" Tex grinned. "Only one way to find out." They unbolted the housing that held the governor assembly, a delicate piece of engineering that Detroit engineers swore should never be touched. The governor's job was simple: keep the radial engine from spinning faster than safety allowed. But under field conditions, it also kept tanks sluggish, trapping them in narrow RPM bands. One by one, they pulled the pieces apart. Springs, linkages, a mess of screws they could barely see by lantern light. Each movement was half improvisation, half prayer. They didn't have replacement parts, so failure meant weeks of waiting. But caution had no place left in that tent. Somewhere behind them, someone opened a bottle of Calvados. A small toast was made to horsepower and poor decisions. They reassembled the system without the limiter, bypassing the regulation mechanism entirely. Tex adjusted the throttle cable until it felt right under his fingers. He didn't have instruments, only instinct. "Fire her up," he said. The engine coughed, backfired, then roared to life, louder, deeper, more eager than before. The exhaust flame flashed blue-white. The tachometer needle climbed higher than they'd ever seen it go. Collins yelled, "She's gonna blow." But she didn't. The engine settled into a hard, steady rhythm, like it had been waiting to breathe. At dawn, they decided to test it. The Sherman rolled out of the tent and onto the dirt road. Tex climbed onto the hull as the driver revved the throttle. The tank leapt forward. The gears howled. Mud sprayed in thick arcs behind it. 30 miles an hour, then 35. The mechanics laughed like lunatics. The driver shouted, "This ain't a tank. It's a damn race car." An officer in a nearby jeep slammed his brakes, staring in disbelief as the tank thundered past, kicking up a wake of mud and dust. By the time it skidded to a stop, the men were breathless, covered in grime, grinning like children. Tex slapped the armor plate. "Well, boys, I think we built something Detroit didn't." And from that morning on, every tank crew within earshot wanted to know one thing. What the hell had those drunk mechanics done to make a Sherman outrun a Jeep? When the sun came up over St. Lo, the officers weren't laughing. They stood by the road staring at the mud-splattered Sherman that had just outrun a Jeep and sounded like it was about to lift off. The crew climbed out, faces split with exhausted grins. The engine still idled, rough but alive. Lieutenant Reynolds crossed his arms. "What did you idiots do to my tank?" Tex shrugged, wiping oil from his hands. "Just let her breathe, sir." It wasn't exactly wrong. By removing the governor, the mechanics had freed the engine from its built-in leash. The governor was designed to cap revolutions at around 2,400 RPM to protect against wear. Without it, the radial engine could push closer to 3,000. That small difference, roughly 25% more throttle response, meant the tank accelerated faster, climbed hills easier, and felt dramatically lighter on the controls. In mechanical terms, it was simple math: more revolutions per minute, more torque available at lower gears. But what fascinated everyone was that the tank didn't disintegrate. It held together, as if the machine itself had been waiting for permission to break its own rules. Word spread through the division faster than radio reports. Crews started asking their mechanics to Calvados tune their engines. Some tried it quietly. Others botched the job and blew pistons. The Ordnance Command caught wind of it within a week. They called the modification reckless and unsanctioned. But the results were impossible to ignore. Tanks with the St. Lo tune-up consistently showed 10 to 15% better performance in short-range maneuver trials. Engineers later confirmed that the M4's engine had a safety margin large enough to handle the extra stress. In other words, The limiter had been overly cautious all along. The field had found what the factory never dared to test. A few months later, Detroit Arsenal engineers quietly studied the reports. Some of those illegal adjustments would later influence post-war engine calibrations. The math of the accident was clear. One forbidden tweak, multiplied by exhaustion and alcohol, produced a 30-ton experiment that worked. Genius had nothing to do with it, just fatigue, frustration, and a spark of mechanical heresy. The legend of the Calvados Special spread faster than any order ever written. Within a week, every forward maintenance company in the 3rd Armored Division had heard about the tank that ran like a demon. The story changed with every retelling. Some said the mechanics poured whiskey into the radiator. Others swore they'd swapped in a fighter plane carburetor. None of it was true. But one thing wasn't rumor. The tank was faster. The 33rd Armored Regiment was the first to copy the modification. A crew at Isigny removed the governor from their M4A1 and tuned the throttle linkage with a hammer handle and 2 feet of baling wire. The result wasn't elegant, but when they tested it on a dirt road, the tank sprinted across the field like a greyhound. The driver yelled over the engine noise, "We just built the fastest tank in Europe!" Other units followed. Mechanics began experimenting with everything: carburetor jets, ignition timing, even swapping spark plugs from captured German trucks. The front line turned into a rolling laboratory fueled by coffee, adrenaline, and contraband brandy. By September 1944, the ordnance reports were full of field modifications. Tanks arrived at depots sporting welded-on armor plates made from spare track links, extra fuel tanks scavenged from wrecks, and bizarre contraptions welded to hulls, cages, racks, even makeshift mine rollers. Each idea started as an act of frustration. A crew stuck in mud welded spare track to the hull for traction. Another reinforced the side armor with sandbags and steel doors from a French barn. Nothing was official, but commanders quietly approved anything that worked. The 3rd Armored Division logged a 30% increase in operational uptime between August and October 1944. Not because of supply miracles, but because of what one after-action report called unsanctioned field ingenuity. Every division had its own folklore. The 2nd Armored bragged about a Sherman fitted with dual mufflers that sounded like an airplane. The 4th claimed they'd made a tank that could tow 2 others without overheating. Whether myth or fact, the atmosphere had changed. The men realized that war wasn't about following blueprints. It was about surviving them. One colonel inspecting the Calvados Special simply said, "If it works, it's regulation now." By the time winter came, the modification had become both a joke and a doctrine. The 3rd Armored's tanks were rougher, louder, and faster than when they'd landed in France. Each bore welding scars and crude initials scratched into the armor, the fingerprints of mechanics who had turned chaos into efficiency. The line between sanctioned innovation and drunken improvisation blurred completely. What began as one reckless midnight fix had become part of the Allied machine. It was no longer about genius. It was about survival that looked like genius from a distance. By the end of 1944, the rumor of the governorless Shermans had traveled farther than anyone expected, all the way back across the Atlantic. Somewhere between Antwerp and Detroit, the myth turned into paperwork. Reports from field maintenance officers described unorthodox modifications resulting in improved performance. No names, no alcohol, no laughter, just data. At the Detroit Arsenal, the engineers didn't believe it. They had designed the M4 to precise tolerances, the governor included. It wasn't a safety net, they insisted. It was a necessity. A missing limiter should have meant catastrophic failure. But the reports kept coming. Tanks running smoother, accelerating faster, no engine failures. Someone finally wrote in the margin of a report, "Field conditions contradict theoretical limits." A small inspection team was dispatched to France. They expected chaos, and they found it. At a maintenance depot outside Liège, they met the mechanics. Mud-caked, oil-stained, eyes hollow from exhaustion. The Calvados Special itself sat nearby, patched and scarred, its armor scratched with the words, "Saint-Lô Special No. 1." When the engineers examined the engine, they were stunned. The governor was gone. Fuel lines rerouted. Carburetor timing manual. No safety adjustments, no precision machining. And yet, it worked. They asked Tex Hargrove how he'd done it. He shrugged and said, "Just took out what was holding her back." It was the simplest engineering explanation anyone had ever given. The team ran tests, measured acceleration, and recorded temperatures. The results were undeniable. Marginally higher power output, better throttle response, and slightly higher fuel consumption. All within safe limits. Detroit's engineers were embarrassed. For years they had tuned conservatively, afraid of overloading engines. The soldiers, without knowing the equations, had found the real limit by accident. When the team returned to the States, they filed a report under the title Field Performance Modifications, Governor Limiter Adjustment, Field Results. No mention of Calvados, no mention of luck, just numbers. Months later, design revisions appeared in official blueprints. The new M4A3E8 Easy 8 featured an upgraded engine governor with expanded RPM tolerance and a more responsive transmission. The field mistake had become factory doctrine. Detroit claimed credit. The mechanics who caused it never knew. By war's end, hundreds of Shermans left assembly lines with features inspired by frontline improvisation. Extended track armor, auxiliary fuel mounts, improved gear ratios. What began as a handful of drunk mechanics working in a muddy tent had rippled across an industrial empire. Innovation had not traveled downward from engineers to soldiers. It had crawled upward, from desperation to doctrine, from accident to architecture. In a war driven by blueprints, the front had proved it could redraw them. History would later tell the story differently. The reports filed in Washington spoke of adaptive field ingenuity and distributed engineering. The truth was much simpler and far messier. A group of exhausted mechanics, half drunk on apple brandy, broke a rule and stumbled into progress. Their accident didn't just make one tank faster. It exposed the heartbeat of total war, a machine so vast that even its smallest mistakes could create revolutions. The American war effort prided itself on precision, on the clean lines of Detroit factories and standardized parts. But perfection was a myth. The real strength of the Allied machine wasn't order. It was tolerance for chaos. That's what the Calvados Special proved. In the mud of Normandy, innovation wasn't born in laboratories but in improvisation. The men who bent the rules kept the engines running. They found efficiency not through genius but through defiance. The faster tank became a symbol of something larger, the genius of imperfection. Every weld scar, every scratched armor plate, every misaligned bolt told the same story, that war, for all its machinery, was still a human invention powered by mistakes. After the war, the myth endured. Some said the Calvados Special was destroyed near the Rhine. Others swore it made it to Germany and ran faster than ever. No one could prove it either way. But every mechanic who heard the tale recognized the truth behind it. That sometimes the difference between failure and innovation is a single night of frustration, courage, and too much brandy. When the world looked back, the story was written as an anecdote, a footnote in armored warfare. But inside that footnote lay the blueprint of modern engineering culture. Learn by breaking, fix by feeling, trust the field before the factory. The Calvados Special wasn't just a tank. It was proof that imperfection, under pressure, can outthink perfection. And maybe that's how wars are really won, not by design, but by accident refined into doctrine. The Calvados Special never appeared in any museum. No plaques, no photographs, no medals for the men who made it run faster than it should. It vanished into the churn of war like so many other machines, repaired, repainted, and eventually scrapped. But its legacy outlived steel. The lesson it left behind was simple. The front line always invents faster than the factory can approve. In every war, progress hides in the margins. In midnight experiments, broken tools, and accidents that somehow work. The drunk mechanics of St. Lo proved that human error multiplied by necessity becomes innovation. Because war doesn't reward genius. It rewards whoever keeps the engines running.